At first, I never really minded working the overnight shift at the 7-Eleven near my house, but that changed when they switched it from 2 staff members overnight to 1. Once I was by myself, as a girl I immediately felt less safe in that store overnight, especially since I was only a teenager fresh out of high school at the time. I tried my best to make it work, but the pressure was starting to get to me. And then on the night before I told my manager that I needed to switch shifts, my worst fears came true. It was a little bit after midnight, and it was a surprisingly busy night, believe it or not. Usually by that point, the only people that stop by are just getting gas, but for some reason, we had a few people in the store grabbing some things that they needed. As I sat there checking out a person's order and getting ready to hand them their change, I couldn't help but notice that there was one man who was standing toward the back of the store. He seemed like he was making it look like he was shopping, but then never picked anything up. And every now and then, I swear that I would feel him looking up toward the register. I kept looking over at him to make sure that he wasn't trying to steal anything, but every time I did, he just looked away. Then one by one, everybody in the store began to bring their items up to the register and then left the store. Everyone except for him. Once that last other person walked out the door and got into their car, I looked over to the man and saw that he wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. He was looking right up at me from the other side of the store. I tried to stay calm, but something in my gut told me that I needed to get out of that store as fast as I could. I slowly started to walk away from the register and towards the phone that was on the wall behind me, but as soon as I took a step, the man began running towards the counter. I screamed as he climbed over the small barrier that usually separated me from the customers, and before I knew it, I was staring down the barrel of a small handgun. He began yelling for me to put the phone down as he continued to push the gun in my face, and once I did, he grabbed me by the collar and threw me toward the register. He demanded that I take the money out and give it to him, as well as wanting me to scan a handful of scratch-off tickets for him. I could hear him rummaging through the cigarettes on the wall behind me as I scanned the tickets, but I was too afraid to try to escape for fear of being shot. After I was all done, I hoped that he would just leave, but instead, he tried to pull me away from the counter. I tried to fight him off, but quickly realized it was pointless when I felt the hard metal of the gun hit me in the back side of my head. I could feel myself getting more and more lightheaded as the man dragged me across the store and toward the walk-in freezer. After dragging me inside, he dropped me onto the floor and then left me there to freeze. He closed the door behind me, and I'll never forget the sound of the lock latching from the other side. I tried to sit up, but the head wound was making my head throb. That was when I realized that he didn't take my phone out of my pocket before leaving me. I managed to slowly move around and muster the strength to pull the phone out of my pocket, but as I dialed 911, I started to get dizzy. And just as I heard the operator's voice answer, my head fell to the floor and I passed out. The next thing I remember is waking up in the back of an ambulance before being brought to the hospital to get a few stitches in the side of my head. Thankfully, the police were able to use the GPS from my phone to find my location and get help to me. The very next day, I called my boss and told them that I needed to switch off the night shift, and she totally understood. For a while, I was working midday shifts as a security guard over at a small hotel that was only 5 minutes away from my house, and I couldn't have asked for a better job. That all changed though when I got transferred for a week to work security over at an abandoned building that had just been purchased for remodeling. It wasn't so much the abandoned building part that bothered me at first, it was the overnights. I never really had good experiences working overnight as a security guard, and this certainly wouldn't change that. On my first night at the building, nothing seemed too bad. I had to do a few walkthroughs of the place, but for the most part, I was able to just sit at my desk in the front of the building and make sure that no one tried to vandalize the place or have any parties. I'll never forget how surprisingly quiet it was in the building on that first night. There was no electricity or plumbing active in the building at the time, so it was practically silent. That all changed on the second night. It was about 10:15 and I was just starting to do my second pass-through of the building when I had to stop myself. I began shining my flashlight around as I listened closely. I wasn't quite sure what it was at first, but I could definitely hear a sound coming from deeper into the building. I slowly made my way down the hallway with my flashlight pointing forward, and as I got closer to the source of the noise, it continued to get loud. I stopped myself before rounding a corner as I took in a deep breath. Not knowing what to expect since I still couldn't really recognize the sound, I was hesitant to go any further. I listened closely, hoping to identify the noise, but all I could make out was this strange scratching sort of sound. That's when my head jumped to the conclusion that there was an animal somewhere in the building. Sadly, that wasn't the case, and I ended up being wrong. Before I realized that though, I walked around the corner with confidence, expecting to see some sign of raccoons or something in the hallway. But to my surprise, there was nothing there. I looked around and listened to reassure myself that the scratching sound was coming from that direction, and then I continued to walk toward it. I was standing in the middle of the hall when the sound was loudest, and I quickly realized that it was coming from the other side of the wall. At that point, I still expected it to be some sort of animal to be in the wall because of the scratching noise, but now I was thinking I might have to check each of the rooms to see where it got in from. But again, I was wrong. I slowly approached the entrance to the room that I was closest to and got ready to place my hand on the door and open it. I took in a deep breath, hoping that there wasn't anything dangerous on the other side, and then slowly opened the door and stepped into the room. I almost jumped out of my skin when I looked toward the wall that I heard the scratching sound coming from, because to my surprise, instead of an animal, I saw a person crouched over in the corner, clawing violently at the wall. I tried to step back out of the room without them noticing me, but as the floorboard creaked when I took the weight of my left foot off of it, they snapped their head in my direction. Even though I was clearly looking at a grown man, it was almost as if I was staring down a horrifying predator as he bared his teeth at me and began to scream as violently as he was clawing at the wall. I started to step back out of the room as fast as I could when the man stood from his crouched position and began running toward me. I slammed the door shut behind me and began running through the building back toward the front entrance. With every step that I took as I ran, I could hear the man behind me making these strange shrieking-like noises as he chased me through the halls. Thankfully, I managed to keep my distance from him as I reached my station and grabbed the radio that I used to communicate with my manager on duty. After grabbing the radio, I continued running until I was out of the building, and then I let my boss know that he needed to get the police down to the building as fast as they could. I kept my distance from the building, but continued to watch the front door to see if the man who chased me had left, but I didn't see anything. That being said, by the time the police got there, he must have escaped the same way that he snuck in, because there was no sign of the man. We went back to the room that I found him in and checked out the wall that he was clawing through, and we couldn't find anything. But according to the officers, the man was likely looking for copper wiring to scrap or sell for whatever habits he had. No matter what his reasoning was for being there, I let my boss know that I either needed another guard with me overnight or I needed to be transferred to a different building. They were very understanding and actually ended up sending me back to the small hotel that I was working at before the overnight shifts. My first maintenance job was for a building in Chicago back in 1996. And to this day, I can say that I've never worked another job like it. The position was for an overnight maintenance worker / building superintendent, and as soon as they offered me the job, I took it. It came with an office in the basement that I shared with the daytime workers, and I got 3 days off every week, so all in all, it didn't seem too bad on paper. But I learned pretty quickly that I would need to entertain myself because there weren't a lot of problems that needed my attendance overnight. According to the other workers though, that wouldn't be the case during the winter with all of the pipes freezing, so I tried not to get used to it. It was probably the middle of my second week on the job when I got my first official call. and it was up to a new resident that had moved in on the 4th floor. He called in saying that water wasn't coming out of the shower head, so I grabbed my tools and made my way upstairs as fast as I could, eager to show that I was capable of doing good work. And when I got there, I was relieved to find that it was a really easy job. In fact, he probably didn't even need to call me, because the only problem was that the water hookup to the shower was turned to the off position so the water wouldn't pass through the pipe. All I had to do was turn the valve and they were good to go. However, as I went to say bye and to wish them good night, the man stopped me to thank me for my work. I told him that it was no problem at all, and he asked me if I worked the following night. I responded by saying that I do, and if he needed anything to just call down and I'll be up to help. I went back down to the maintenance office after that and had a relatively boring rest of the night. The next day on my shift, I was surprised when I heard a knock on the door. I answered it and saw the tenant that I had helped out the other day with a bag of McDonald's. At first, I tried to tell him that I wasn't able to have visitors in the office, but he was persistent. He said he just wanted to thank me for helping out, so eventually I invited him in to enjoy a burger and fries. I thought he was a little strange with the way he talked, but that changed as we got to know each other a bit better. I learned that he had just moved to Chicago from New York, and we eventually agreed to hang out sometime so I could introduce him to some people. Not long after that, he went back up to his apartment, and that was the last time I saw anyone that night since no one needed any help in their apartments. The following day, around the same time, I heard a knock on the door again, and when I answered it, I wasn't surprised this time to see that same tenant. This time though, things seemed a bit different about him. I told him that I was expecting a pretty busy night and didn't really have time for a meal again, but this time he said that he brought drinks. I chuckled a bit thinking that he was joking because I obviously couldn't drink on the job, but he didn't like that. As soon as I started laughing at what I thought was a joke, the man locked eyes with me and asked in a very quiet voice if I was laughing at him. I told him that I wasn't and that I thought he was making a joke, but by that point, he was already trying to force his way into the office. I tried to hold the door shut, but despite him being a bit smaller than I was, he was able to push right through it. I stepped back as the tenant entered the office, yelling about how I shouldn't go around laughing at people. I tried to explain to him that I didn't mean to offend him, but once he was in better lighting and I saw how big his pupils were, I realized that I wasn't dealing with someone who was sober. I asked the man to please calm down one more time, but before I could finish the word down, he threw the bag of bottles that he was holding in my direction. I tried to catch them, but they slipped right through my hands and smacked me in the bottom of my chin and my throat. I stumbled backward as the man lunged at me. I tried to fight him off as I caught my breath, but it was no use. He easily managed to force me to the ground and then with both hands around my neck, began choking me. The sound of his jumbled screaming began to fade out as everything around me started to turn black. And just like that, I was out. I'm pretty sure that the tenant had thought he killed me, but I ended up waking up sometime later to find that my wallet was missing, as well as the TV in the office and the landline. I went to the first floor and used another tenant's phone to call the police, and they went up to talk to the man who attacked me, but he was nowhere to be found. After searching his apartment, the officers couldn't figure out where he had gone, but they found what they believed to be a trap for me waiting in his room. According to them, they found handcuffs along with various knives and a large roll of plastic stashed underneath the tenant's bed. The man never returned to the apartment, and we ended up getting rid of all his things by the end of that month before cleaning and putting it back up for rent. I only worked at that job for another couple of months before a better position opened up at another building owned by the same company, and I never looked back. Walking through the forest on a hike used to be one of my favorite experiences in the world, until one day I ended up getting lost. It happened while I was on a walk along a trail that I had hiked dozens of times, only this time I decided to go down one of the pathways that I had never taken before. However, after walking for a couple of hours, I slowly realized that what I was walking on wasn't a hiking trail, but instead an old game trail. And just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, the clouds began to roll in. I tried to follow the trail back, but the sunlight quickly faded from the sky as it quickly began to downpour. The rain was coming down in torrents as I made my way through the dense woods. As time dragged on, the day turned to night, and I was nowhere near finding my way back yet. The dark, stormy night made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead of me, and I spent hours trying to find my way back to the trailhead, but it seemed like every turn I took was the wrong one and just led me deeper into the heart of the forest. As the rain soaked through my clothes, a sense of unease began to settle over me. There was no denying it anymore. I was lost. Panic started to rise within me, but I knew that I had to stay calm. I couldn't afford to make any rash decisions. I needed to think clearly if I wanted to make it out of the woods alive. I tried to reorient myself, but there was no way that I could find any sense of direction through the storm that night. I cursed under my breath, feeling a sinking feeling in my stomach. I had relied too heavily on technology and hadn't brought a compass or a backup map. I decided to keep walking, hoping that I would stumble upon a familiar landmark or a sign that would point me in the right direction. The more I walked, the more disoriented I became. The rain seemed to distort my perception of distance and time, and every step I took felt like a step deeper into the unknown. As the night wore on, I realized that I had no choice but to seek shelter until the rain subsided. I spotted a large tree with a hollowed-out trunk and decided to take refuge there. It was far from ideal, but it offered some protection from the rain. Inside the hollowed trunk, I huddled against the damp wood, shivering from both the cold and fear. The sound of raindrops hitting the leaves above me was deafening, drowning out any other noise. As I tried to rest a bit and wait for daylight, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that there was something lurking in the darkness just beyond my sight. I tried to close my eyes and rest, but sleep eluded me. Every rustle of the leaves or snap of a branch set my heart racing. The woods seemed alive with unseen creatures, their presence both haunting and menacing. And eventually, I couldn't take the anxiety anymore, and something in my body told me that I needed to keep moving. So I slowly got up and once again began hopelessly wandering the dark and dreary forest. As the night dragged on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I thought I caught glimpses of shadowy figures darting between the trees. I couldn't be sure if it was my imagination playing tricks on me or if there was something truly out there. Doubt and fear began to consume me. I questioned my every decision, berating myself for getting lost in the first place. The woods had transformed from a place of beauty and tranquility into a nightmare, a prison from which I just couldn't escape. Hours passed in agonizing silence. The rain finally began to taper off, and a glimmer of hope sparked within me. I walked for what felt like an eternity, my legs heavy and my mind weary. Just as I was about to lose all hope, a flicker of light caught my eye. It was a distant glow, barely visible through the trees. With renewed determination, I stumbled toward it, pushing through thick foliage and slippery mud. As I emerged from the woods, I found myself standing at the edge of a road. Relief washed over me like a tidal wave. A passing car stopped, and I climbed in, grateful for the warmth and safety it provided. Looking back at the woods disappearing into the distance, I couldn't help but feel a sense of profound gratitude. I had survived the night. The ordeal had pushed me to my limits, and yet I survived. I'll never forget my first night alone in my new house. It was a small one-bedroom home that was about 20 minutes away from my job on the outskirts of the city. After spending the day packing, I couldn't wait to go to sleep, but the storm that night seemed to keep me awake. The pitter-patter of rain against the window pane filled the room as I lay in bed, struggling to find sleep on that stormy night. The dim glow of the streetlights outside was casting eerie shadows that almost danced across the walls. The atmosphere was heavy and unsettling, but I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination running wild. As I drifted in and out of consciousness, a sudden chill swept over me, causing me to jolt awake. I could feel it. It was like there was a presence in the room. My heart raced, and I slowly turned my head from one side of the room to the other. That was when I saw it. As soon as I glanced at the window, there it was, illuminated by the faint glow of the streetlight. I saw a pair of eyes staring directly at me. Fear coursed through my veins as I realized I was being watched. Panic set in, and I pulled the covers up to my chin, shielding myself from the intruder's gaze. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but my voice seemed to be trapped within me, stifled by a combination of terror and disbelief. What was really terrifying was the fact that I noticed the person looking through my window. It was as if they were unfazed. The eyes outside the window remained fixed on me, unblinking and filled with an unsettling intensity. Who was this person? What did they want from me? My mind raced with countless questions, each one more terrifying than the last. Summoning all my courage, I slowly rose from the bed, careful not to make any sudden movements. The rain continued to drum against the glass, creating a disorienting soundtrack to this nightmare. I approached the window with trepidation, my heart pounding in my chest. As I drew nearer, the figure's features became clearer. It was a man. His face was being obscured by the shadows. I could feel his piercing gaze as if he could see into the depths of my soul, and the realization sent shivers down my spine. With trembling hands, I fumbled for my phone and dialed 911, desperate for help. But as I held the phone to my ear, all I heard was a dead silence, a complete absence of sound. It was as if the outside world had ceased to exist, leaving only me and the intruder locked in this macabre dance of terror. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as I stood there, paralyzed by fear. The seconds that passed felt as if they dragged for hours, and the entire time the figure outside remained a motionless silhouette against the backdrop of rain-soaked streets. After a moment of locking eyes with the stranger, I managed to muster up the courage to reach for the curtains and draw them closed, hoping that he would just disappear. But as I reached forward, I paused as I noticed his eyes following my arm. I drew a deep breath into my lungs as I quickly finished closing the curtains, and then I took a step back from the window. It was as if a wave of relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The realization that the intruder was still there, only now I couldn't see them, almost made the situation worse. And as I stood there wondering if I should open the blinds or not, I decided against my better judgment that I should at least check to see what they were doing. I slowly leaned forward and peered out through the crack in the center of the curtains, and I was surprised to see that the strange man was no longer there. I stepped back again and began thinking to myself, where had he gone? Would he return? That was when I heard it. A chill coursed through my body, and I turned to face my bedroom door as I heard the unmistakable sound of someone trying to turn the doorknob at the front door. I slowly moved out of my bedroom and into the hallway where I could clearly see the entrance to the house, and as I got closer to the door, I was certain that the noise I was hearing was the handle. I quickly closed the distance between myself and the door and turned the deadbolt lock to make sure that the door was secure, and when I did, the person on the other side must have heard it. They were no longer trying to turn the door handle anymore. Instead, the sound of banging coming from the other side made it seem like they were trying to kick the door in. I yelled out for them to stop, and when they didn't, I decided to lie and said that I called the police. At that moment, the banging on my front door stopped, and the only sound I could hear outside was the sound of raindrops. I waited by the front door for a few minutes and listened before walking around and ensuring that all the entrances into my home were sealed up. I spent the remainder of the night in a state of heightened vigilance, my senses on high alert. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, sent my heart racing. Sleep was an impossible feat, as the image of those haunting eyes continued to haunt my thoughts. Morning finally broke, bringing with it a sliver of reassurance. The sun's rays chased away the darkness, filling the room with warmth and light. But despite the daylight, a lingering sense of unease remained. I immediately contacted the authorities, recounting the terrifying events of the previous night. They arrived promptly, offering their reassurances and promising to investigate. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched, that the intruder's presence lingered even in his absence. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, but the incident remained etched in my memory. I became hyper-vigilant, installing security measures and double-checking every lock and window in my home. Sleep eluded me, plagued by nightmares of those piercing eyes. To this day, I am haunted by the knowledge that any time I look out my window, someone might be there watching me. The rain cascaded down in relentless sheets on that stormy night, obscuring my view of the road ahead as I embarked on a late-night drive through the desolate countryside. The rhythmic swish of the wipers was the only sound accompanying the drumming of raindrops against the windshield. The world outside seemed cloaked in darkness, both figuratively and literally, as if holding a secret I was about to uncover. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles turning white with each passing mile. The desolate stretch of road seemed to stretch on indefinitely, lined with towering trees that swayed ominously in the wind. I couldn't help but feel a creeping unease settle over me, as if I was trespassing in a place where I didn't belong. Suddenly, the headlights illuminated a figure standing on the side of the road. I squinted my eyes and saw that it was a hitchhiker. They were soaked from head to toe and holding out a desperate thumb. Against my better judgment, I felt a twinge of compassion and pulled over, rolling down the window. "Need a lift?" I called out over the sound of the rain. The hitchhiker nodded with a look of gratitude etched upon their face as they climbed into the passenger seat. Their presence brought a sense of relief, as if the darkness had temporarily lifted. The air in the car grew heavy with silence, broken only by the drumming of rain against the roof. As we drove, a sense of foreboding settled over me. I stole glances at the hitchhiker, attempting to discern their features through the rain-streaked window, but their face remained hidden, concealed by the shadows. "So, where are you headed?" I asked, trying to break the tension. They turned their heads slowly toward me, their eyes glinting in the dim light. "Anywhere," they replied with an unnerving smile. "I don't really have a plan yet." I thought that was a strange response. Unease gnawed at the pit of my stomach, but I pushed my fears aside. I told myself I was just being paranoid and that they were just a person seeking shelter from the storm. But as we continued down the rain-soaked road, the hitchhiker's demeanor began to change. Their smile twisted into a sinister grin, and their eyes glowed with an otherworldly intensity. Panic tightened its grip on me, and I considered pulling over and demanding they leave the vehicle. But fear held me back, chaining me to this macabre journey. Minutes turned into hours, and the world outside became a blur of darkness and rain. The hitchhiker's presence grew increasingly unsettling, their body language sending waves of unease coursing through me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was trapped, an unwitting passenger in a sinister game that was taking place in my own car. Finally, unable to bear the tension any longer, I made a split-second decision. I abruptly pulled over, my heart pounding in my chest. "I'm really sorry about this, but I'm going to have to ask you to get out of the car, please," I said, my voice quivering with both fear and resolve. I pointed at a building that wasn't too far away and said that he could find shelter there, as I hoped he would just get out. That was when the hitchhiker turned to me, their eyes gleaming with an unholy light. "You know, I was about to ask you the same thing," they hissed, their voice dripping with malevolence. Without waiting for a response, I realized that I had brought danger into my car and was now concerned about what would happen if I didn't listen to them. I threw open the car door and stumbled out into the rain-soaked night. I could feel their gaze burning into my back as I ran, my footsteps splashing through puddles, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't dare look back, fearing what I might see. Minutes turned into an eternity as I sprinted through the darkness, desperate to put distance between myself and the haunting presence that had infiltrated my car. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my legs threatened to give way beneath me, but I pressed on, fueled by adrenaline and sheer terror. Finally, another passing car saw me running through the rain and pulled over to see if I needed help. I explained to them what had happened to me, and they were kind enough to let me use a cell phone that they had. I made 2 calls, one to the police who came and took my statement, and one to my dad to let him know that my car had been stolen and I needed someone to pick me up. The police told me that they would keep an eye out for my car, but they never followed up on that, which tells me that the hitchhiker I had helped out stole my car that night. And although that sucked, I'm thankful that I was able to escape the incident unscathed and unharmed.